Welcome to Sleepy Stories, a place where history meets rest. Here we share gentle, soothing tales about the lives of remarkable historical figures. From inventors and explorers to artists and leaders, each story is told slowly, softly, and with a calming rhythm, designed to ease your mind and guide you into sleep. Whether you want to unwind after a busy day, relax before bed, or simply enjoy peaceful storytelling, Sleepy Stories will be your companion for a restful night. So, get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history help you drift into dreams. Birth and early world, 740–750s. Tonight, we visit the life of Charlemagne, the man who would later be called the father of Europe. His story begins in the year 742, more than 1200 years ago, in a world that feels distant yet quietly alive when we let our minds drift into its rhythms. The world into which he was born was one of forests and rivers, of monasteries and markets, of villages scattered across the land, where smoke rose gently from wooden houses and church bells echoed through the morning air. The exact place of Charlemagne's birth is uncertain. Some sources say it was at Herstal, in present-day Belgium. Others suggest Liège, or even Aachen in what is now Germany. The records of the 8th century were not always precise, and so the details of his first breath are hidden in a soft veil of mystery. Yet perhaps this uncertainty itself adds to the timelessness of his story. For what matters most is not the exact stone house or the field beyond the window where he first saw the light, but rather the life he would go on to live, and the echo of it that would shape centuries to come. Charlemagne's father was Pepin the Short, a man of ambition and strength. Pepin had been born into the family of the Carolingians, who were rising steadily in power. Before Pepin, the rulers of his family had served as mayors of the palace, the officials who truly controlled the Frankish kingdom, while the Merovingian kings, the so-called do-nothing kings, wore their crowns in ceremony but not in power. With the blessing of the Pope, Pepin stepped beyond tradition. In 751, he was crowned King of the Franks, ending the line of the Merovingians and beginning a new dynasty that bore his family's name. Charlemagne's mother was Bertrada of Laon, remembered for her wisdom and patience. She is often called Bertha Broadfoot, a name passed down with affection, though its origin is not entirely clear. She was known as a woman of calm judgment and steady grace, qualities that she must have carried into the household where young Charles was raised. In later years, when Charles himself grew into a leader, people often remarked on the mixture of stern resolve and gentle balance that marked his character. Perhaps it was from Bertrada that he inherited some of this quiet strength. As an infant, Charles, known at first simply as Carolus or Charles, was unaware of the tides of history flowing around him. His world was smaller, softer. It was the warmth of fires in the long halls of Frankish residences, the murmur of voices in the evening, the rhythm of footsteps on wooden floors. It was the smell of bread baked in the kitchens, the warmth of woolen blankets, the sound of rain on rooftops, and the comfort of being held close in the arms of his mother. The world outside, with its shifting alliances and battles, did not yet touch him. His life was sheltered in the innocence of early childhood. Yet even in his earliest years, Charles lived in a world where contrasts were everywhere. The Frankish realm was one of forests that seemed endless, of rivers that cut through valleys, of fields where wheat and barley swayed in the wind. But it was also a realm of warriors and oaths, of swords carried at the side of noblemen, of banners raised in loyalty to kings. For a boy born into a royal household, life was never entirely separate from these two realities, the gentle rhythm of the land and the stern demands of rule. The residences of the Frankish kings were not castles of stone, as we might imagine from later centuries, but large wooden halls or fortified villas surrounded by farmland. Within these halls, life carried on in a mixture of work and ceremony. There were attendants who tended fires, cooks who prepared meals of bread, meat, and mead, warriors who guarded the household, and priests who said prayers in the chapel. Little Charles would have grown up among all of these figures, watching them, listening to their voices, learning in quiet ways what it meant to be the son of a king. Education for a royal child in the 8th century was not the education we think of today. Charles would not have spent his youth with books in neat rows, for books themselves were rare and precious, written by hand on parchment. Instead, his learning came from practice, repetition, and the guidance of elders. From an early age, he was taught to ride a horse. To ride was to rule, for a Frankish king was expected to lead his men in war from horseback. He learned to hunt in the forests, to handle a spear and sword, to be strong in body and steady in movement. At the same time, he learned prayers, hearing the words of the Latin Mass, words that carried mystery even if they were not yet fully understood. The priests and monks who surrounded his father's court would have instructed him in the basics of the Christian faith, teaching him about God, about the saints, and about the eternal order that gave meaning to the world. The Frankish world of Charlemagne's childhood was deeply Christian, but it was also shaped by older traditions. The Franks still carried echoes of their Germanic past, of warrior customs and ancient songs. These blended with Roman traditions that had not entirely faded, for the roads, the law, and the memory of empire still lingered. Into this mixture came the rhythm of the church, with its bells and chants, its feasts and fasts, its promise of unity. Charles's earliest impressions were formed in this rich blend of faith, culture, and tradition. Beyond the halls of his family's residences, the land itself must have left deep marks on his young imagination. Imagine him walking as a boy along the edges of fields, hearing the calls of birds in springtime, watching the shifting clouds above the horizon. Imagine him sitting by a fire in winter, listening to the crackle of wood as stories were told. Stories of saints and martyrs, of warriors and kings, of the mighty Romans who had once ruled the world. These stories must have stirred something within him, planting the idea that life could stretch far beyond the horizon, that one's destiny might be larger than the narrow space of one's birth. The Europe of 742 was not a single place, but a patchwork of lands and peoples. To the west lay the kingdoms that would become France. To the east stretched the lands of the Saxons, fierce and resistant to Christian influence. To the south lay Lombard Italy and the distant shadow of Rome, where the Pope guarded the relics of saints and the heritage of faith. The Byzantine Empire still ruled far to the east, holding the memory of Roman grandeur in Constantinople. For young Charles, all of this was far away, but in time, these lands would all touch his life. For now, though, his world was smaller, simpler. It was the daily rhythm of meals taken with family, of lessons in riding and prayer, of hearing his father's voice in council, of seeing his mother move quietly through the halls. It was the warmth of summer fields, the hush of autumn evenings, the deep silence of winter nights. In all these things, the seed of destiny was quietly growing. Charlemagne's early years remind us that even the greatest figures in history begin in the same way as all of us, as children who look with wide eyes upon a world that feels both mysterious and familiar. In the little boy born in 742, there was no crown yet, no empire, no legacy. There was only the unfolding of days, one after another, each carrying him gently forward. And so, in the quiet dawns and the lingering twilights of his early years, in the rhythm of faith and family, in the balance of nature and nurture, the life of Charlemagne began. Like the slow flowing of a river that will one day become mighty, his story was just beginning its course. Rise of the Carolingians. When Charlemagne was still a boy, the world around him began to change in ways that would shape his destiny. His father, Pepin the Short, was not merely a noble among nobles. He was the man who brought the Carolingian family from the shadows of service into the bright, weighty light of kingship. And as Pepin rose, his son Charles watched, listened, and learned what it meant to rule. The Frankish kingdom in the middle of the 8th century was a place both strong and fragile. Its armies were powerful, its people loyal, and its lands rich in fields, rivers, and forests. Yet its leadership was uncertain. For many generations, the Merovingian dynasty had ruled in name, but not in power. These kings, sometimes called the do-nothing kings, still wore their long hair, still sat on thrones, and still carried the ancient titles of rule. But real power had slipped from their hands. It was the mayors of the palace, the chief officials of the royal household, who truly governed, and among these mayors, the family of the Carolingians had risen steadily. Pepin was one of these men. He was the son of Charles Martel, a figure remembered in history as the victor of the Battle of Tours in 732, when Frankish forces turned back Muslim armies advancing into Gaul. Charles Martel had been strong, decisive, and full of energy, and he had passed on both his ambition and his position to his sons. Among them, Pepin the Short stood out not for towering height. He was, as his name suggests, of smaller stature, but for a clear, determined will. He was clever, patient, and above all, willing to step beyond custom when custom no longer served. As Charles grew from infancy into boyhood, he must have seen his father often at council, speaking with nobles, priests, and envoys. The halls of Pepin's court would have been filled with the murmur of serious voices, the scratching of quills on parchment, and the sound of oaths sworn before altars. For a boy in such a household, the lessons were constant, even when unspoken. He would have seen the way his father carried himself with calm authority, the way decisions were made not by force alone, but by balance, by listening, by promising, by commanding at the right time. In 751, Pepin made a choice that would alter the course of history. The Merovingian king, Childeric III, still sat on the throne, his long hair marking him as the symbol of royal blood. But his role was ceremonial, a crown with little weight. Pepin sent envoys to Pope Zachary in Rome, asking a simple but profound question. Who should be king, the one who bore the title, or the one who held the power? The Pope answered that the man who held power should bear the crown, and so, with papal blessing, Childeric was deposed, his hair cut to mark the end of his royal line, and Pepin was anointed as king of the Franks. For young Charles, this moment must have been striking. To see his father not only hold power, but also wear the crown, was to see the transformation of family destiny. The Carolingians were no longer servants of kings, they were kings themselves. And with that crown came both honor and responsibility, both promise and burden. Charles, as the eldest son, was now heir not just to a household, but to a dynasty. The ceremony of Pepin's anointing would have been deeply symbolic. Oil poured upon his head by the hands of the Pope's representatives, prayers spoken, hymns sung, and banners raised. The Frankish nobles would have sworn loyalty, lifting their swords in silent promise. The Church, by blessing Pepin, tied the new dynasty to sacred authority, weaving divine approval into the fabric of Carolingian rule. And among the crowd, watching with young eyes, was Charles, learning that kingship was not only about ruling men, but also about standing beneath the gaze of heaven. In the years that followed, Pepin ruled with energy. He waged campaigns against foes beyond Frankish borders, securing lands and protecting the Church. He marched into Aquitaine, where resistance simmered. He campaigned in Burgundy, in Provence, and into the lands of the Lombards in Italy, who threatened Rome. Each campaign required careful preparation, supplies gathered, horses bred and trained, warriors armed, and priests ready to bless the banners. Charles, though still young, would have witnessed the rhythms of this life, the gathering of men, the sound of horns, the clatter of hooves, the prayers before departure. Life in the Frankish kingdom was full of movement. The royal household did not remain in one place, but travelled across the realm. Courts and councils were held in different towns and villas, following the needs of rule. Charles grew up not in a single palace, but across a landscape, carried along by the rhythm of the kingdom. Each place had its own feel, some halls large and echoing, others smaller and intimate, some lands rich with vineyards, others with deep forests. For a boy, this constant travel was a kind of education, teaching him the breadth of the realm that would one day be his. Through all of this, Charles's own character was beginning to form. He was tall, strong, and full of energy, traits that would serve him well in adulthood. He observed much and remembered more, listening closely to the voices of priests, warriors, and his father's counselors. He was learning not only the arts of war, but also the arts of patience, persuasion, and rule. Religion played a central role in this period. The alliance between the Carolingians and the papacy grew deeper. In 754, Pope Stephen II himself crossed the Alps into Frankish lands, a remarkable journey for a pope of that era. He anointed Pepin once more, and this time also blessed his sons, Charles and his younger brother Charlemagne, marking them as heirs to the throne. Imagine the scene: the Pope in solemn robes, the oil poured upon the foreheads of the boys, the prayers spoken in Latin, the gathered nobles watching in silence. For Charles, still in his early teens, it must have been a moment both awe-inspiring and heavy with meaning. The weight of expectation settled more firmly upon him. In these years, Charles grew from child to young man. He rode horses with increasing skill, his long legs and strong frame well suited to the saddle. He learned to hunt with hawks, to track game in the forest, to throw a spear with accuracy. At the same time, he sat at the feet of priests, hearing the stories of Scripture, learning the Psalms, and listening to the chants of the church. He was not a scholar in the deepest sense. He would never master Latin fully, but he understood its rhythms, its meaning, and the authority it carried. The Frankish people saw him not just as the king's son, but as the hope of continuity. In an age where dynasties rose and fell quickly, the sight of young Charles at his father's side reassured nobles and commoners alike. He was tall, already carrying himself with dignity, his presence a quiet promise of the strength to come. And so, in these early years of Pepin's reign, the foundation of Charlemagne's life was laid. He saw what it meant to be king, to balance power with faith, to lead warriors into battle, to protect the church, and to hold together a realm of many lands and peoples. He learned that kingship was not only about the sword, but also about the blessing of oil, the weight of oaths, and the weaving of alliances. The rise of the Carolingians was more than a shift of crowns. It was the dawn of a new vision of rule, one that tied together the strength of the Franks and the guidance of the church. And in the heart of that dawn stood a young man, Charles, growing each day into the role that awaited him. Becoming king, 768. The years moved gently forward, as they always do, carrying Charles from youth into early manhood. The rhythm of seasons continued. Spring rains filling rivers, summer warmth ripening fields, autumn harvests gathering the year's labour, and winter's hush settling over the Frankish land. Within this steady rhythm, moments of change began to shape not only the course of Charles's life, but also the destiny of the realm. By the year 768, Charles was 26 years old. He had grown tall, broad-shouldered, and commanding. Accounts from later years describe him as powerfully built, with a presence that filled the room. His face was firm, his eyes bright, his movements steady. He was not only strong in body, but also sharp in observation. He had lived long enough to witness his father's reign, to learn from his example, and to feel the weight of expectations placed upon him. That year, Pepin the Short, king of the Franks, fell ill. The man who had taken the crown from the Merovingians, who had stood before popes and armies alike, who had led campaigns across the realm, was now nearing the end of his life. Illness came in those days as a quiet shadow, often without clear cause, often without remedy. And for rulers, as for all people, the end could come suddenly. Pepin knew that his time was short, and he prepared for the future of his sons. The Frankish custom was clear. When a king died, his kingdom was divided among his sons. It was a practice rooted in the old traditions of inheritance, meant to honor each child's claim. Yet it was also a practice that carried risk, for division could weaken unity, and brothers could become rivals. Pepin followed this custom. He declared that after his death, the kingdom of the Franks would be shared between his two sons, Charles and his younger brother, Charlemagne. The decision was solemnized, and Pepin's final days passed quietly. He died on September 24, 768. His body was taken to the royal abbey at Saint Denis near Paris, the resting place of kings. There monks chanted prayers, incense filled the air, and candles flickered in long rows. Nobles and warriors gathered to pay their respects, their voices hushed in the presence of death. For Charles, the loss of his father was both personal and political. He had lost the man who had guided him, the model of kingship whose example had been before him since childhood. At the same time, he inherited half of a kingdom, a responsibility that now rested heavily upon his shoulders. Charlemagne, his brother, inherited the other half. Together, they were to rule the Frankish people. The division of the realm was marked with ceremony. Charles took his seat as king in Noyon, a city in northern Gaul. There he was acclaimed by nobles, lifted upon a shield in the ancient Frankish tradition, and anointed with holy oil by the church. Charlemagne, meanwhile, was anointed in Soissons, another city with deep Frankish roots. Each brother was now a king, each bearing the crown, each ruling his own lands, yet both tied to the same people, the same traditions, and the same destiny. At first, the two brothers ruled side by side in uneasy balance. Charles's lands lay largely in the northern and western parts of the realm, stretching across Gaul. Charlemagne's lands lay more to the east and south, closer to Burgundy, Provence, and parts of Aquitaine. Together, the kingdom still formed a great realm, yet division created tension. Nobles sometimes favored one brother over the other. Priests and envoys had to navigate carefully between courts. And always, there was the unspoken question: could two brothers truly rule in harmony? Charles carried himself with confidence, already displaying the qualities that would define his reign. He moved among his people with presence, listening to their concerns, commanding respect through his height and strength, but also through his patience and balance. He understood that kingship required not only the sword, but also the voice, not only war, but also the art of binding men together. Charlemagne, by contrast, was more reserved, perhaps more cautious, perhaps more difficult. Their personalities did not always align, and their counsels sometimes ended in disagreement. The first test of their rule came quickly. In Aquitaine, a region long resistant to Frankish control, unrest grew once again. Pepin had campaigned there, but the region was not fully subdued. Now, with a new generation of rulers on the throne, Aquitaine tested the strength of the brothers. Charles gathered his forces, riding south with warriors, banners, and supplies. The air must have been filled with the sound of hooves and horns, the sight of shields glinting in the sun, the prayers of priests rising before battle. Charlemagne, however, did not support the campaign with equal enthusiasm. Their cooperation faltered, and the cracks in their shared rule began to show. For the Frankish people, this was a moment of uncertainty. They had seen strong kings before, and they had seen realms divided and weakened. Would the Carolingian dynasty hold together, or would it fracture under the strain of divided leadership? For Charles, the challenge was both practical and personal. He had to prove himself not only as his father's son, but also as a king in his own right, a man capable of leading, protecting, and uniting his people. Despite the tensions, Charles pressed on with determination. His presence in Aquitaine was strong, his leadership clear. Step by step, he showed that he had the will and the ability to command. His warriors trusted him, his nobles looked to him, and his people began to see in him the same strength they had once seen in Pepin. In these years, Charles also began to think of his future in terms of alliances. Marriage was not only a personal bond, but also a political tool, a way of weaving ties between families, kingdoms, and peoples. He first married Himiltrude, a noblewoman whose connection brought him support. Later, he would marry others, forming alliances across the realm. These unions were not always lasting, but each carried meaning, strengthening his position as king. The years between 768 and 771 were formative. Charles was still young, still learning, still shaping his style of rule, yet already the outlines of his greatness could be seen. He was firm yet flexible, decisive yet patient. capable of leading in battle and commanding respect in council. He was a man who embodied both the physical strength of a warrior and the steady presence of a ruler. Then, in 771, the course of history shifted once again. Charlemagne, Charles's brother, fell ill and died suddenly at the age of just 20. His death was unexpected, a reminder of how fragile life could be in those times. With Charlemagne gone, the division of the Frankish realm ended. Charles became sole king, inheriting the lands of his brother and uniting the kingdom once more under a single crown. The moment was decisive. What might have been a time of endless rivalry between brothers, of divided rule and constant tension, was now transformed into a moment of unity. Charles stood alone as King of the Franks, ruler of a realm stretching across much of Western Europe, a realm with deep traditions, strong warriors, and the blessing of the Church. For Charles, the years of shared rule had been a lesson. He had learned how fragile unity could be, how difficult it was to share power, and how important it was to act decisively when the moment demanded it. He had also learned that destiny does not wait forever. It comes suddenly, sometimes with the quiet passing of a brother, sometimes with the solemn lifting of a crown. And so, by the end of 771, Charles was no longer only the son of Pepin, no longer merely one of two kings. He was now Charlemagne, the great Charles, sole ruler of the Franks, the man upon whose shoulders the weight of the kingdom now fully rested. The story of his true reign was about to begin. The early campaigns in Italy, 773-774. The kingdom of the Franks, now united under the sole rule of Charles, was vast, but the world beyond its borders stirred with challenges and calls for aid. Across the Alps, in the Italian lands where ancient Rome had once stood as a mighty empire, new powers had risen, and among them was the kingdom of the Lombards. Strong, determined, and sometimes restless, the Lombards had long pressed upon the papal lands, threatening the security of Rome and the independence of the Pope. The bond between the Frankish kings and the Roman Church had been carefully woven by Pepin the Short, Charles's father. When Pepin had sought legitimacy for his crown, it was the Pope who had blessed him, who had sanctified his rule as chosen not only by men, but by God. That bond, once formed, became a cornerstone of Carolingian power. And now, in the late 770s, the Pope once more turned his gaze northward, across the mountains, seeking aid from the Franks. Pope Adrian III had ascended to the papacy in 772. He inherited a fragile position, with the Lombards pressing upon the papal states, threatening Rome itself. Their king, Desiderius, was ambitious and bold, testing the boundaries of papal independence. Adrian, wise and resolute, knew that his forces alone were not enough to withstand the pressure, and so, as had been done before, he looked to the Franks, to Charles, for protection. The request reached Charles at a moment when his power was still consolidating. He was newly the sole king, his brother Charlemagne having died only a year earlier in 771. His authority was secure, yet still fresh. To answer the Pope's call was not only a matter of faith, but also of politics. To defend Rome would bind Charles more deeply to the Church, giving his reign a sacred sheen of legitimacy. To defeat the Lombards would extend Frankish influence into Italy, strengthening his realm beyond its borders. In the year 773, Charles gathered his warriors. The call to arms echoed through the Frankish lands. Nobles summoned their vassals, warriors prepared their gear, horses were fed and shod, supplies were loaded into wagons. The great host of the Franks began to assemble, a tide of men and horses, shields and lances, banners and prayers. To march into Italy was no small task, for the Alps stood between the Franks and their goal. The Alps were immense and daunting, mountains that seemed to pierce the sky, their peaks capped with snow, their slopes steep and treacherous. For travellers, the crossing was slow and perilous, filled with narrow paths, sudden storms, and icy winds. For an army, the challenge was greater still. Yet Charles, with his determination and steady presence, led his men into the heights. Step by careful step, they advanced, winding along rocky paths, driving herds of animals, dragging carts, lifting supplies where the paths were too narrow. The march itself became a test of endurance, a proving ground for both king and army. Days stretched long, the cold biting at their faces, the thin air pressing upon their lungs. At night, fires glowed faintly against the darkness. Warriors huddled beneath cloaks, the sound of the wind whistling through the crags. Yet through it all, Charles remained calm, moving among his men, encouraging, guiding, showing by his presence that they would endure and reach their goal. When at last the Franks descended into the plains of northern Italy, the Lombards were waiting. King Desiderius had gathered his forces, hoping to resist the invasion. The Lombards were fierce fighters, armoured and resolute, their banners fluttering in the Italian wind. Yet they faced not only the strength of the Frankish warriors, but also the determination of Charles himself. The confrontation came near the city of Pavia, the Lombard capital. Charles advanced with steady pressure, surrounding the city, cutting it off from supplies. Siege warfare in those times was a slow and grinding effort. The Franks built lines of encampments, their fires glowing in the night. They tightened their grip day by day, waiting, watching, pressing the defenders into hunger and weariness. Months passed. The siege wore on through the seasons. Inside Pavia, the Lombards endured scarcity, their strength dwindling. Outside, Charles maintained his steady presence, a figure of patience and resolve. He was not only a warrior, but a strategist, understanding that time itself could be a weapon. Finally, in the spring of 774, Pavia surrendered. The Lombard kingdom, long a power in Italy, now lay beneath the hand of the Franks. Charles entered the city with dignity, not as a ravager, but as a ruler. He was crowned with the Iron Crown of Lombardy, taking upon himself the title, King of the Lombards. It was a title that no Frankish king had borne before, a sign that the realm of Charles was growing not only in strength, but also in breadth. With the conquest complete, Charles journeyed to Rome. There, he was received with solemn ceremony by Pope Adrian III. The city of Rome, ancient and venerable, opened its gates to the Frankish king. Bells rang, chants rose, incense filled the air. In the great basilicas, beneath the arches and mosaics, Charles and the Pope stood together, one the leader of Christendom in the West, the other the leader of the Church. Their bond was sealed with prayer and blessing, with the promise of mutual support. For Charles, this moment was more than political success. It was a turning point in his vision of kingship. He was not merely a ruler of the Franks, not merely the heir of Pepin, but now a king who held sway over multiple peoples, multiple lands, and who bore a sacred trust to protect the Church. The bond between crown and altar, between sword and cross, became clearer than ever. The campaign in Italy also revealed qualities of Charles Chaz's rule that would endure throughout his life. His patience in siege, his determination in hardship, his willingness to endure long trials for the sake of greater reward. It showed his ability to balance the sword with ceremony, conquest with blessing, power with reverence. The return to his realm was marked with triumph, but also with quiet reflection. The Franks had endured the Alps, faced the Lombards, and prevailed. Their king had not only guided them to victory, but had also lifted their realm into a new stature in Europe. Yet Charles knew that his work was not complete. Each victory carried with it new responsibilities, new alliances, and new challenges waiting just beyond the horizon. And so, as he returned from Italy, wearing the crown of the Lombards and carrying the blessing of the Pope, Charles continued to grow into the figure who would one day be remembered as Charlemagne, the Great Charles, a man whose reign would shape the destiny of Europe itself. The Saxon Wars, 772–804. The Frankish realm, now crowned with new honours from Italy, stretched across fertile fields, rivers, and forests. Yet along its northern and eastern edges lay lands that were untamed and unconquered, inhabited by the Saxons. They were a proud and fierce people, dwelling in the thick forests and marshes of what is now northern Germany. Their lives were bound to the rhythms of the earth, their gods tied to rivers, trees, and stones. To them, the Christian faith of the Franks was foreign, and the authority of Charles was unwelcome. For decades before, the Franks and Saxons had clashed along their borders. Raids, skirmishes, and reprisals were common, like the ebb and flow of a restless tide. But when Charles came to the throne, the Saxon frontier became more than just a border. It became the centre of a long and unyielding struggle, one that would stretch across his entire reign. It began in the year 772, even before Charles's Italian campaigns. A Saxon raid had struck deep into Frankish territory, burning churches and villages. The response was swift. Charles gathered his forces and marched north into Saxony. The landscape was different from the plains of Italy, a land of dense forests where shadows stretched long, where rivers wound like silver threads, where pathways were narrow and uncertain. It was a land that could swallow armies, a land that tested both courage and patience. Charles advanced with determination, striking at the very heart of Saxon belief. Near the river, Weser stood the Irminsul, a sacred pillar, perhaps carved from wood or stone, perhaps a tree itself, depending on the accounts. To the Saxons, it was a symbol of their gods, a centre of their faith. To destroy it was to strike at the spirit of their resistance. Charles ordered it torn down. The Franks smashed the sacred pillar, scattering its fragments, and in its place raised the cross of Christ. This act set the tone for the wars to come. They would not be wars of conquest alone, but wars of faith. Wars that sought not only to subdue, but to convert. For Charles, the unity of his realm depended upon the unity of belief. To leave the Saxons pagan was to leave them outside the circle of Christendom, forever restless, forever hostile. To bring them into the church was to bind them, body and soul, to the Frankish realm. The Saxons, however, were not easily subdued. Their resistance was fierce, their warriors skilled in ambush and retreat. They struck from the forests, then vanished into shadows. Time and again, they rose in rebellion, even after pledging submission. The wars became a cycle of campaigns, battles, surrenders, and renewed uprisings, a rhythm that stretched on for more than 3 decades. Charles returned to Saxony year after year. His armies marched north through summer fields, camped in the shadow of forests, and crossed swollen rivers. He built forts to secure his gains, placing garrisons to hold the land through winter. He called upon missionaries and priests to baptize the conquered, to plant churches where pagan shrines had once stood. At every turn, he combined the sword with the cross, force with faith. Among the Saxons, a leader arose who embodied their resistance, Widukind. His name would become legendary, a symbol of defiance. Widukind was elusive, sometimes fighting openly, sometimes vanishing into exile, always returning to lead new uprisings. To the Franks he was a rebel, to the Saxons a champion. His presence kept the flame of resistance alive, even when the odds seemed overwhelming. The wars were brutal at times, marked by bloodshed and harsh reprisals. In 782, after a Saxon revolt, Charles ordered the execution of thousands of captives at Verdun, an act that cast a long shadow across his reign. It was meant to break resistance, to send a message that rebellion would not be tolerated. Yet even such severity could not fully extinguish the Saxon spirit, and so the struggle continued. Year by year, campaign by campaign, Charles pressed forward. His patience was unyielding. He was like the steady river that wears down the stone, not through sudden force alone, but through constancy. He fought battles in summer, endured harsh winters, returned each spring with new determination. He built not only forts, but also bridges and roads, weaving Saxony more tightly into the fabric of his realm. Gradually, slowly, the Saxons were drawn into the Frankish fold. Each rebellion ended with new surrenders, new baptisms, new bonds of loyalty. Widukind himself, weary of exile and struggle, came at last to Charles. He was baptized, a gesture of submission, but also of transformation. With his conversion, the resistance of the Saxons began to fade. By 804, more than 30 years after the wars had begun, Charles declared the struggle complete. Saxony was no longer a restless frontier, but part of the Carolingian realm. Churches stood where forests had once echoed with pagan rites. Frankish law and custom extended across the land. The Saxons, though subdued by force, were now bound by faith, brought into the wide embrace of Christendom. For Charles, the Saxon wars were both a burden and a triumph. They consumed countless years, countless campaigns, countless lives. Yet they also defined his reign, shaping him as a ruler who combined persistence with vision, who would not rest until his realm was united in both body and spirit. In the quiet after the wars, as he looked back upon those long decades, Charles might have remembered the forests and rivers, the smoke of burning villages, the endless marches of his armies. He might have remembered the defiance of Widukind, the harsh choices of war, the patient work of missionaries. He might have seen in it all the pattern of his kingship, a steady, unyielding pursuit of unity, a belief that to rule was to guide not only the lives of men, but also their souls. And so the Saxon frontier was transformed. Where once there had been division and defiance, there was now inclusion, however uneasy, within the Frankish world. It was a hard-won peace, born of long struggle, yet it was peace that would endure, carried forward into the greater story of Charlemagne's reign, expansion into Bavaria and beyond, 788. The Saxon frontier had consumed years of Charles's reign, years of long marches, shifting battles, and the steady pulse of conversion and conquest. Yet, while Saxony lay to the north, other lands drew his gaze to the east and south. Among them was Bavaria, a duchy nestled between forests, rivers, and mountains, where the people were strong, proud, and bound by their own ancient traditions. Bavaria was ruled by Duke Tassilo III, a man of the Agilolfing family, whose lineage stretched back for generations. Tassilo was not merely a regional lord, he was a figure of ambition and independence. Though he owed nominal allegiance to the Frankish crown, he acted often as if his duchy stood apart, forging alliances, ruling with autonomy, and maintaining ties to powers beyond the Frankish sphere. His marriage to Liutperga, daughter of the Lombard king Desiderius, further entwined Bavaria with Italian ambitions. For Charles, this independence was a challenge. His vision was of a realm united, of borders secured, of peoples drawn into a single fold. Bavaria, though Christian, stood too proud, too separate, a duchy that needed to be bound more tightly to the Carolingian centre. The stage was set for confrontation, though it would come not through sudden war, but through careful pressure, diplomacy, and the steady march of power. The lands of Bavaria were rich and varied. To the west stretched fertile plains, watered by rivers like the Danube and the Inn. To the south rose the Alps, towering peaks where snow lingered year-round, where valleys cut deep and rivers tumbled down in clear cascades. To the east lay forests thick and ancient, stretching toward the lands of the Slavs and Avars. Villages dotted the countryside, churches rang with bells, monasteries rose as centers of prayer and learning. It was a land worth holding, a land Charles could not ignore. In the late 780s, pressure mounted. Charles accused Tassilo of breaking oaths of loyalty, of failing to uphold his duties as a vassal. At the same time, envoys from Tassilo's rivals whispered in Charles's ear, urging him to act. The Pope too favoured stronger Frankish influence, for Bavaria's ties to the Lombards had once threatened papal security. Gradually, step by step, the case was built against Tassilo. In 787, Charles moved with quiet decisiveness. His forces marched into Bavaria, their banners unfurled, their presence undeniable. Yet unlike the wars in Saxony, there was little need for long campaigns. The weight of Frankish power was too great. Facing the reality of overwhelming strength, the Bavarian nobles turned against their duke. At a great assembly in 788, Tassilo was deposed. Stripped of power, he was sent into monastic exile, living out his days in prayer and obscurity, a reminder of the fragility of independence in the face of empire. With Tassilo's fall, Bavaria passed fully into Charles's realm. Its people now looked to him as king, its lands now woven into the Carolingian fabric. Monasteries flourished, churches grew stronger, and Frankish law took root. The duchy, once semi-independent, became a cornerstone of Charles's empire, a gateway to the east, a foundation for further expansion. For Charles, the acquisition of Bavaria was more than just the addition of land. It was a step toward a greater vision. With Bavaria secured, the eastern frontier opened. Beyond lay the Avars, a people of the steppes, heirs to nomadic traditions that stretched back across Asia. They lived in great encampments, their wealth measured in horses and treasure, their power feared by neighbors. To bring them into submission would be a new challenge, one that required both military might and unshakable resolve. The campaigns against the Avars began not with sudden conquest, but with probing raids, with the steady testing of strength. Charles's forces, led by loyal counts and dukes, advanced into the lands beyond the Danube. They struck at the great ring forts of the Avars, immense encampments filled with treasure gathered from years of raids. The fighting was fierce, but Frankish persistence prevailed. One by one, the ring forts fell. The treasure captured was immense, said to fill wagons upon wagons, carried westward to enrich the Frankish realm. Gold, silver, jewels, silks, ornaments, all the gathered wealth of generations, was brought to Charles. Much of it was given to the church, placed in monasteries and cathedrals as offerings, symbols of victory dedicated to God. The rest flowed into the veins of the kingdom, strengthening its economy, rewarding its nobles, securing loyalty through generosity. The defeat of the Avars was not only material, but symbolic. It showed that even the distant peoples of the steppe, fierce in their independence, could be brought low by Frankish might. It extended the aura of Charles's power farther east, sending ripples across Europe, carrying his name into lands he would never personally walk. Meanwhile, in Bavaria itself, the integration deepened. Frankish counts were installed, monasteries became centers of education, priests spread the Christian faith, and travelers carried news of the wider world. The land that had once looked more to Italy now looked firmly to the north and west, to Aachen and the Carolingian court. The change was gradual, felt in the rhythms of daily life, in the prayers sung in churches, in the laws administered in courts, in the presence of Frankish authority in every town and village. For the Bavarians, life under Charles brought both continuity and change. They still ploughed their fields, tended their flocks, and marked the seasons. Yet now their festivals included the great feast days of the wider church. Their monasteries copied not only local texts, but also writings from distant lands. Their sons might march beneath the banners of the Franks into wars far from home. They were part of something larger, a realm that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, from the North Sea to the Alps. Charles, for his part, saw Bavaria not only as land conquered, but as land entrusted to him. His sense of duty, shaped by faith and by vision, compelled him to weave its people into the unity of Christendom. He visited, he held assemblies, he ensured that justice was done, that law was clear, that the bonds between ruler and ruled were firm. His rule was not only the sword, but also the staff, not only conquest, but also stewardship. The year 788 thus marked another turning point in his reign. With Bavaria secure, with the Avar threat diminished, Charles stood as a ruler whose power stretched farther than any Frankish king before him. His authority was felt not only in Gaul and Saxony, but in Italy, Bavaria, and beyond. He was more than a king among kings. He was becoming a figure whose shadow reached across the continent. And yet, in the gentle quiet between campaigns, Charles might have reflected not only on the victories of arms, but also on the deeper purpose of his reign, to bring unity where there had been division, to bring faith where there had been doubt, to bring order where there had been chaos, to gather the scattered peoples of Europe into a single flock, guided not only by his hand but by the cross of Christ. Thus, Bavaria and the lands beyond were not only conquests, but chapters in a greater story. the story of a ruler whose vision extended beyond the horizon, who sought not merely to govern, but to shape the destiny of a world, relations with the papacy and the foundations of empire. The victories in Bavaria and against the Avars gave Charles new strength, yet his vision was not only of armies and borders. His reign was woven with threads of faith, and among those threads, the bond with the papacy shone brightest. The relationship between king and pope, crown and altar, would shape not only his life, but also the destiny of Europe, laying the first stones of what would become the Holy Roman Empire. The bond between the Franks and the papacy had been carefully nurtured for decades. Charles's grandfather, Charles Martel, had defended Christendom against the advance of Muslim forces at Tours. His father, Pepin the Short, had sought papal blessing to legitimize his crown, replacing the old Merovingian dynasty. In return, Pepin had protected the Pope and strengthened the Papal States, ensuring that Rome would survive as a spiritual center free from Lombard control. Now it was Charles's turn to continue that partnership, to deepen it, to give it new form. In the year 774, after his conquest of the Lombards, Charles had journeyed to Rome. Pope Adrian I received him with solemn ceremony, leading him into the ancient basilicas where incense hung in the air, and the light of candles flickered upon marble floors. The people of Rome welcomed him as a protector, a king who had lifted the Lombard shadow from their city. In those sacred halls, Charles reaffirmed the bond between crown and cross, pledging himself as defender of the church. The years that followed strengthened that alliance. Charles and Adrian exchanged letters, warm in tone, filled with references to faith, duty, and mutual support. Charles saw himself not only as a political ruler, but as a shepherd entrusted with the care of Christendom. Adrian, in turn, saw in Charles the strong arm of protection, the one who could secure Rome against its enemies. Their partnership was not without challenges. Questions of land and authority sometimes stirred tension. The Pope sought to expand the Papal States, while Charles sought to maintain balance among his lords and bishops. Yet the friendship endured, carried by a shared vision of unity under God. When Adrian died in 795, Charles mourned the loss deeply. In his place came Pope Leo III, a man of courage and determination, but also one who faced bitter opposition in Rome. His enemies accused him of corruption and sought to strip him of office. In 799, Leo was attacked in the streets, beaten, and nearly blinded. He escaped and fled north, crossing the Alps to seek refuge at Charles's court in Paderborn. The arrival of the Pope at a Frankish court was no small matter. Imagine the scene. Leo, weary from his journey, entering the halls where Charles held council, surrounded by nobles, warriors, and clergy. The Pope, successor of Saint Peter, had come as a supplicant, seeking safety. Charles received him with dignity, offering protection, listening to his case, assuring him that justice would be done. Charles knew that this was more than a personal matter. To support Leo was to uphold the sanctity of the papacy itself. If a pope could be driven from Rome by force, the spiritual foundation of Christendom would tremble. To defend Leo was to defend the Church, and in defending the Church, Charles also strengthened his own claim as its protector. In 800, Charles travelled to Rome to settle the matter. The city welcomed him once more with ceremony and joy. In the great Basilica of St. Peter, Leo swore an oath of purity, denying the accusations against him. The matter was resolved, and his authority was restored. Yet what followed would become one of the most significant moments in European history. On Christmas Day of that year, as Charles knelt in prayer at St. Peter's, Pope Leo placed upon his head a crown. The people cried out, "To Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and peace-giving Emperor of the Romans, life and victory." In that moment, Charles was not only king of the Franks and Lombards, but emperor, a title that carried echoes of ancient Rome. The coronation was both unexpected and transformative. Some accounts suggest Charles was surprised that he would not have entered the basilica had he known Leo intended to crown him. Perhaps he feared the appearance that the Pope, rather than God, had given him the crown. Yet whatever the details, The act itself reshaped the map of history. The Roman Empire, long thought fallen in the West, had been reborn in new form, the Holy Roman Empire. Charles now stood as emperor, a figure whose authority was not merely regional, but universal in scope. He saw himself as guardian of Christendom, ruler of a renewed Rome, heir to emperors past, yet also servant of the Church. The crown upon his head was more than metal. It was a symbol of unity, of continuity, of destiny. The implications were profound. To the east, in Constantinople, the Byzantine emperors still claimed to be the sole heirs of Rome. To see a Frankish king crowned as emperor was to see their claim challenged. Diplomacy was delicate, but eventually Charles and the Byzantines recognized one another, dividing spheres of influence, acknowledging the reality of shared authority. Within the West, the coronation gave new shape to governance. Charles now ruled not only by might, but by sacred sanction. His decrees carried the weight of imperial authority. His assemblies echoed with a new solemnity. His subjects saw in him not only a king, but the emperor chosen by God, crowned in the holy city of Rome. And yet, for all the grandeur of titles and ceremonies, Charles remained a man of steady habits. He still rose early, still prayed, still held court with patience, still walked among his people with the same commanding presence. The crown had changed the world's perception of him, but it had not altered his character. He bore the weight of empire with the same mixture of firmness and humility that had marked his kingship. In the quiet of Aachen, his favoured residence, Charles might have reflected on the path that had led him to this moment. The battles in Saxony, the sieges in Italy, the assemblies in Bavaria, all had prepared the way. The friendship with Adrian, the trials of Leo, the prayers in St. Peter, all had woven together into a single thread that now bound him to history. The coronation of 800 was not an end, but a beginning. It laid the foundations of an empire that would endure in name for centuries, an empire that would shape the idea of Europe, an empire where the bond of faith and power was written into its very essence. For Charles, it was another step in a journey that was not yet finished. There were still campaigns to fight, reforms to enact, knowledge to spread, and unity to strengthen. Yet from that Christmas day onward, he bore not only the name of king, but the mantle of emperor, a title that would echo across the ages. The imperial coronation and its meaning. 800. On a winter morning in the year 800, the city of Rome stirred with quiet anticipation. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from the hearths of homes that lined its narrow streets. Pilgrims, priests, and townsfolk made their way toward the great basilica of St. Peter's, their footsteps echoing against stone walls worn smooth by centuries of use. Within those walls, something remarkable was about to unfold, something that would shape the destiny of Europe and give Charlemagne a new place in the order of history. Christmas approached, the most sacred day of the Christian year. It was a day when hearts turned toward the birth of Christ, when bells rang out in celebration, when candles glowed in churches across the land. Yet in this particular year, the festival of light would carry an even greater radiance, for in the midst of prayer and worship, a king would become an emperor. Charlemagne, tall and commanding even in his later years, entered the basilica with humility. His frame was broad, his step steady, his presence both kingly and human. He wore no crown as he came to kneel before the altar, for he came as a servant of God, a man ready to give thanks for victory, protection, and grace. He had fought wars, secured lands, defended faith, and offered peace. Now, on this morning, he simply knelt, as any believer might, before the mysteries of heaven. The basilica itself was vast, filled with shadows and light. Candles flickered, their flames dancing upon marble columns and mosaics that told stories of saints and martyrs. The air was thick with incense, sweet and heavy, curling upward like prayers rising toward the heavens. The chants of the clergy filled the space, deep and resonant, a rhythm that seemed to slow the heartbeat and calm the restless mind. Those who gathered felt themselves suspended between earth and heaven, between the weight of history and the promise of eternity. At the appointed moment, Pope Leo III approached. He carried with him not only the authority of his office, but the burden of Rome itself. Months earlier, he had been driven from the city, beaten and disgraced by his enemies. It was Charlemagne who had restored him, who had defended his honor, who had ensured that the Pope could sit once more upon the throne of St. Peter. Now Leo stood ready to return that gift in a manner both symbolic and eternal. As Charlemagne knelt in prayer, unaware, or perhaps only half aware of what was to come, Leo placed upon his head a crown. In that single gesture, centuries of history seemed to turn like a great wheel. The Roman Empire, long fallen in the West, was reborn in new form. The people cried out with joy to Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and peace-giving Emperor of the Romans, life and victory. The sound filled the basilica, rolled through its arches, and spilled into the streets beyond. In that moment, Charlemagne became emperor. Not merely king of the Franks, not merely conqueror of the Lombards, not merely protector of Rome, but emperor, an heir to the grandeur of Caesar and Constantine, Augustus and Justinian. The crown upon his head was more than gold. It was a symbol of unity, of continuity, of divine favor. It declared that the work of Rome, the vision of Christendom, and the destiny of Europe were bound together in him. And yet, the act carried mystery. Some say Charlemagne was surprised that he would not have entered the basilica had he known what Leo intended. Others believe he had long prepared for this, that the moment was the fruit of years of careful planning. The truth, like much of history, lies somewhere in the shadows. What is certain is that the coronation was both a gift and a burden, a source of glory and a source of responsibility. To be crowned emperor was to be lifted into a new sphere. It was to hold not only the loyalty of armies, but the prayers of peoples. It was to be seen as defender of the church, guardian of the faith, father of Christendom. It was to carry upon one's shoulders the weight of centuries and the hopes of generations. For Charles, who had long lived with a sense of duty, it was perhaps not an honor he sought, but it was an honor he accepted, for he understood that history itself had placed it upon him. The meaning of that Christmas Day coronation reached far beyond the basilica walls. To the east, in Constantinople, the emperors of Byzantium still claimed to be the sole heirs of Rome. To them, the act was a challenge, a declaration that Rome had two thrones, two centers of authority. Diplomacy would later soften the sting, but the tension remained. A reminder that the idea of empire was larger than any one city. Within the West, however, the coronation gave new life. It told the people of Christendom that they were not scattered tribes, not merely kingdoms divided by rivers and mountains, but a single people united under God and under an emperor. It gave form to the dream of Europe as a common home, a dream that would echo through centuries, shaping kings and councils, wars and treaties, faith and thought. For Charlemagne himself, the crown was both blessing and trial. He was a man of simple habits, who ate plain meals, who dressed modestly, who spoke with clarity and directness. He had no taste for unnecessary grandeur, no love of excessive pomp. Yet the crown demanded ceremony, demanded ritual, demanded that he stand not only as a man, but as a symbol. It was a balance he would navigate for the rest of his life, seeking always to remain grounded even as history lifted him high. In the quiet of later evenings, as the fire crackled in his hall at Aachen, one imagines Charles reflecting upon that Christmas day, the chant of the clergy still echoing in his ears, the weight of the crown still pressing upon his brow, the cries of the people still alive in his memory. He had not sought the title, but he had been given it. He had not dreamed of being emperor, but he had become one. In the silence, he might have whispered a prayer, that he would be worthy of what had been entrusted to him. The coronation of 800 was not merely an event, it was a beginning. It opened the door to reforms in law and learning, to unity across lands and peoples, to a new sense of identity for the West. It planted the seeds of an idea that Europe was more than its kingdoms, that it was a civilization bound by faith, guided by reason, sustained by memory. And so the meaning of that day lingers, soft as candlelight, steady as chant, strong as stone. It was the day when a king knelt in prayer, and when, by the hand of a pope and the will of God, he rose as emperor. Administrative reforms and governance. After the crowning moment in Rome, when the crown of an emperor was placed upon his head, Charlemagne carried within him not only the memory of chants and incense, but the clear sense that a vast empire must be guided with wisdom, not only with strength. Armies had built his realm, victories had expanded its borders, but victory alone could not sustain it. For the empire to endure, for the people to prosper, for the bond between crown and faith to remain strong, there had to be order. There had to be laws, councils, decrees, and men entrusted to carry them out. Charlemagne was no dreamer content with titles. He was practical, deliberate, and attentive. The empire he ruled stretched across much of Western and Central Europe, from the Atlantic coast of Gaul to the heartlands of Germany, from the rolling fields of northern Italy to the rugged lands of the Pyrenees. Each region spoke in different tongues, practiced customs rooted in deep history, and was ruled by local counts and dukes who managed villages, farmlands, and towns. Without careful guidance, without steady hands, such a realm could fall into confusion. And so, Charlemagne began to weave a fabric of governance. He drew threads of law, threads of faith, threads of loyalty, and bound them together into something lasting. His rule was not merely about conquest. It was about administration, about justice, about ensuring that the humblest peasant and the mightiest noble alike understood that they lived under one order, one law, one empire. He issued capitularies, long and detailed documents that set forth the laws and decrees of the land. These capitularies were read aloud in assemblies, carried from region to region, so that no one could claim ignorance. Some dealt with matters of war and tribute, others with the protection of the church, still others with the conduct of judges or the care of the poor. In them, Charlemagne's voice echoed as both king and father, stern yet thoughtful, practical yet compassionate. But decrees alone were not enough. How could one man in Aachen, or one emperor in distant halls, know what was happening in the valleys of Bavaria, in the vineyards of Burgundy, in the towns along the Rhine? For this, he devised the system of the missi dominici, the envoys of the Lord King. These men, chosen with care, were sent in pairs, one noble, one cleric, across the empire to act as the emperor's eyes and ears. The missi dominici travelled from court to court, from village to village, hearing complaints, checking on the administration of justice, ensuring that the decrees of the emperor were being carried out faithfully. They listened to peasants who felt wronged, to monks who feared encroachment, to merchants who sought fair trade. They reported back to Charlemagne himself, carrying with them not only parchment and seals, but the very pulse of the empire. In their journeys, they wove the distant provinces into a single fabric, reminding every region that the emperor was present, even if unseen. Charlemagne also held great assemblies, known as placita generalia, where nobles, bishops, abbots, and representatives of his realm gathered together. In these councils, held in spring or early summer, matters of law, governance, and war were discussed openly. There, Charlemagne listened as well as spoke, weighing the advice of his lords, hearing the concerns of his clergy, guiding debate with patience. These gatherings were not only political, they were a ritual of unity, a way of showing that the empire was not ruled by decree alone, but by shared counsel. Justice was dear to him. The empire was vast, and disputes could arise anywhere, between nobles, between neighbours, between church and laymen. Charlemagne sought to make justice predictable, fair, and rooted in both Christian teaching and the customs of the people. Judges were instructed to follow the law carefully, to act without corruption, to remember that they would answer not only to the emperor, but to God. If any man, rich or poor, felt mistreated, he could appeal, and the missi dominici could intervene. Yet Charlemagne was not blind to the challenges. Local lords sometimes resisted, seeking to preserve their own power. Old tribal customs sometimes clashed with new decrees. The diversity of languages, Frankish, Latin, Lombard, Saxon, made communication difficult. But the emperor did not give up. Patiently, steadily, he pressed forward, building bridges of law and faith so that the empire might endure beyond his own lifetime. Aachen, his chosen capital, became the heartbeat of this order. From its halls, clerks wrote and copied documents, messengers carried sealed letters, advisors gathered to draft decrees. The palace was more than a residence. It was an administrative center where parchment and ink carried as much weight as swords and shields. Within its walls, the rhythms of governance echoed, the scratching of quills, the murmurs of clerics, the steady footsteps of messengers. For Charlemagne, governance was not cold duty, it was an extension of his vision. He saw himself as a shepherd tending a flock, as a father caring for his children. In letters, he referred to his subjects with affection, reminding them of their duties but also of his concern. He wanted order, yes, but he also wanted peace, stability, and the flourishing of faith and learning. At times, his reforms touched daily life in ways both small and profound. He issued decrees about weights and measures, ensuring that trade was fair. He regulated the conduct of markets so that merchants could sell without deceit. He instructed that tithes be collected to support the church and the poor. He even gave attention to the care of royal lands, mandating how estates should be managed, how vineyards should be tended, how livestock should be kept. To him, no detail was too small if it touched the well-being of his people. And through it all, the presence of faith was constant. Bishops and abbots were central to administration. Monasteries served as centers of record-keeping and learning, preserving the decrees of the emperor alongside the sacred texts of the church. Charlemagne himself often consulted his clerics, seeking their counsel in matters both spiritual and practical. To govern an empire, he believed, was not merely to manage land and people, but to serve God's plan. The reforms of governance may not have carried the drama of battles or the grandeur of coronations, but they were the quiet foundation of the empire. Without them, conquest would have been fleeting. With them, the empire became something more than a patchwork of lands. It became a structure, a vision, a legacy. In the evenings, when the halls of Aachen grew quiet, when the candles burned low, when the hum of clerks faded into silence, Charlemagne might have walked slowly through his palace. He would have known that the strength of his empire did not lie only in walls or swords, but in the careful work of governance, the parchment sealed with wax, the envoy on the road, the judge at his bench, the farmer confident in fair trade. These too were victories, though quieter ones, victories that would outlast him if nurtured well. And so he continued, year after year, patient and steady, building not only with stone and steel, but with law and order, weaving his empire into something that could endure beyond his lifetime, something that might stand as a reflection of his vision, a realm of unity, justice, and faith, guarded by the hand of an emperor, guided by the light of God. Cultural and educational renaissance. When we think of kings and emperors, we often imagine swords drawn high, banners in the wind, and the clash of armies upon the field. Yet for Charlemagne, the true greatness of a ruler was not measured only in battles won or territories gained, but in the light he could bring to the minds of his people. For him, the empire was not simply land and walls, but a garden in which learning, faith, and culture could take root and bloom. And so, alongside his campaigns of conquest and his reforms of governance, he began another kind of campaign, one of the spirit, one of knowledge, one of light. It is here that we enter what later historians would call the Carolingian Renaissance, a rebirth of learning and culture, a gentle flowering of education and scholarship, nurtured under the steady hand of the emperor. Charlemagne himself had not been trained in the classical way of the ancient philosophers. As a boy, his education was practical and religious, focused on Latin prayers, law, and the skills of a warrior king. He spoke his native Frankish tongue with ease, and he understood Latin well enough to pray, to command, to rule. He tried, even in his later years, to learn to write, keeping wax tablets near his bed so that he could practice letters at night. His hand was never graceful upon the page, yet his mind was sharp, curious, restless. Though he lacked the polish of a scholar, he carried within him the hunger of one. That hunger drove him to gather scholars from across Europe, men of learning who could bring wisdom and method to his court. From Italy came Peter of Pisa, skilled in grammar and rhetoric. From Spain came Theodulf of Orleans, a poet and thinker. From England came the man who would become dearest to him in matters of learning, Alcuin of York. Alcuin was gentle, patient, and brilliant. He had studied at York in the tradition of the Venerable Bede and brought with him a love for the scriptures, for classical learning, for the careful training of young minds. When Charlemagne met him, he recognized at once the value of such a companion. Alcuin became not only an advisor, but a friend, guiding the emperor in matters of study, helping to shape the schools of the realm, and ensuring that knowledge would not be lost in the tides of time. In the palace at Aachen, Charlemagne created a palace school, a place where his own children, noble youths, and even the emperor himself gathered to learn. Lessons in grammar, logic, astronomy, music, and theology filled the air. The halls that once echoed with the tramp of guards now carried the softer murmur of recitation, the scratching of quills, the turning of parchment. Here, the emperor sat not only as ruler, but sometimes as pupil, eager to learn from the men he had gathered, eager to nourish his mind as he had nourished his empire. But the light of learning was not to be confined to the palace alone. Charlemagne decreed that every monastery and cathedral should establish a school so that boys, noble and common alike, might learn to read and write, to sing the psalms, to understand the faith. These schools became the seedbeds of education for generations to come. From them grew the tradition of learning that would carry Europe through the centuries, preserving the wisdom of the past and preparing minds for the future. One of the most lasting fruits of this Renaissance was the development of a clear, beautiful style of writing known as Carolingian minuscule. Before this reform, manuscripts were written in cramped, difficult hands, letters pressed tightly together, often without spaces or punctuation. Reading such texts was slow, laborious, and prone to error. Under Charlemagne's guidance, and with the work of his scholars, a new script was developed, rounded, clear, and elegant, with spaces between words and a system of punctuation. This script spread across the empire, copied in monasteries, used in schools, carried by scribes. It made reading easier, learning swifter, and copying more faithful. More than that, it became the ancestor of many scripts that followed, influencing the very shapes of letters that we still read today. In the quiet work of pen and parchment, the Carolingian Renaissance left a gift that endures upon every page we hold. Charlemagne also cared deeply for the preservation of ancient texts. He recognized that the wisdom of the Romans, the words of the Church Fathers, and the poems of antiquity were treasures too easily lost. He instructed his scholars to seek out old manuscripts, to copy them carefully, to guard them against decay. In monasteries across the empire, monks bent over desks by candlelight, copying line after line, preserving Virgil and Augustine, Cicero and Gregory, ensuring that voices from centuries past would not be silenced. To Charlemagne, this work was not separate from faith, it was part of it. To preserve wisdom was to honor God's gifts, to bring light into darkness, to strengthen the church. Knowledge was a lamp, and he believed it should burn brightly in every corner of his realm. Even in matters of worship, he sought clarity and harmony. He encouraged the standardization of liturgy so that the prayers of the faithful might rise in unison across the empire. He supported the training of choirs, the teaching of music, the copying of hymnals. In this way, the worship of God was enriched, not only with devotion but with beauty, sung in voices that carried both discipline and joy. At Aachen, scholars debated questions of theology and philosophy, guided by the emperor's curiosity. Charlemagne listened to discussions of the Trinity, of the nature of Christ, of the mysteries of creation. He loved astronomy, gazing at the stars, learning their courses, seeking to understand the heavens. He loved the order of grammar, the logic of words, the play of language. Though he was a warrior by birth, his heart delighted in the quiet strength of the mind. The Carolingian Renaissance was not a sudden blaze, but a steady flame, tended with care. Its fruits were not always dramatic, but they were enduring. A generation grew up in its light. Priests more learned, nobles more thoughtful, scribes more skillful, children more curious. The empire gained not only soldiers and farmers, but thinkers, singers, and teachers. And in the gentle rhythm of study and prayer, something of Charlemagne's own spirit was revealed. He was a man who sought order in all things, in law, in faith, in culture. Just as he built bridges of governance, he built bridges of knowledge, linking past to present, present to future. At night, when the day's councils were ended and the torches burned low in Aachen, one can imagine Charlemagne sitting quietly with a book upon his lap. Perhaps it was a psalter, its words familiar, its verses soothing. Perhaps it was a manuscript of Roman wisdom, lines of Virgil flowing before his eyes. His large hands might turn the pages slowly, his eyes moving with effort, his lips shaping words softly. For him, the act of reading was not only study, it was devotion, it was rest, it was wonder. And so, through patient years, the emperor of warriors became also the emperor of learning. His legacy was not only carved in stone or sung in chronicles, it was written in the gentle curves of letters, preserved in the words of ancient authors, carried forward in the minds of children taught to read. In this way, Charlemagne's reign became a bridge, carrying the wisdom of the old world into the new, ensuring that light would not be lost in the dark. The Carolingian Renaissance was a gift to his people, a gift to the church, a gift to time itself. And like all true gifts, it was born not of pride, but of care, not of conquest, but of love, for learning, for faith, for the enduring strength of knowledge, religious policy and church relations. When one thinks of Charlemagne, one cannot separate the crown of gold from the cross of Christ. To him, rulership was not a matter of earthly power alone. It was a sacred trust, a calling bound tightly with the will of God. His empire was not just land and cities, but a Christian people, joined in prayer, bound by faith, and united under the watchful gaze of heaven. To govern them was to shepherd them, and to shepherd them was to care not only for their bodies, but for their souls. From his earliest days as king, Charlemagne saw the church not as something distant from his throne, but as its partner. The priests and bishops who surrounded him were his counselors. The monks in their abbeys were his guardians of learning and prayer. The Pope in Rome was his ally, his brother, sometimes his equal, and sometimes, whether by accident or providence, his subordinate. To Charlemagne, there could be no empire without faith, and no faith without the careful hand of governance. He gave time and care to the standardization of worship, for he believed that prayers should rise to heaven not as a scattered murmur, but as a single harmonious voice. Across the wide reaches of his empire, local traditions of worship had grown uneven and diverse. Different chants, different rituals, different ways of celebrating the sacraments. To Charlemagne, this variety seemed disorderly, and disorder was an enemy of unity. And so, with quiet determination, he brought in scholars and clerics to revise and harmonize the liturgy. Roman practice became the standard, replacing local variations, ensuring that from the forests of Saxony to the plains of Aquitaine, the Mass was sung with one rhythm, one structure, one solemn beauty. He also encouraged the teaching of the Roman chant, a precursor to what would later be known as Gregorian chant. Choirs were trained, hymnals copied, and the very sound of worship was reshaped to match his vision of order. But his influence went beyond music. Charlemagne held a deep concern for the moral and spiritual life of his people. He issued decrees, known as capitularies, that touched upon matters of faith as well as law. These documents instructed clergy on how to live, how to teach, how to guide their flocks. They reminded priests of their duties, warned against corruption, and encouraged the faithful to follow the sacraments diligently. His vision of Christian life was both grand and practical. He wanted every parish to be a place of learning as well as prayer, so that children could learn the Psalms, letters, and catechism. He wanted sermons preached in the local tongue, so that common people could understand God's word, not only hear it in Latin. He wanted priests to live simply, avoiding the temptations of wealth and pride, so that they might serve as examples of virtue. At times, his hand was heavy. He saw little room for hesitation or compromise in matters of faith. His campaigns against the Saxons were as much about religion as they were about politics. The Saxons resisted baptism, clung to their ancient gods, and rebelled again and again against Frankish rule. Charlemagne, believing himself God's chosen instrument, sought to bring them into the Christian fold by force if persuasion failed. Thousands were baptized under compulsion, and laws were passed with harsh penalties against those who refused. To modern ears, this may sound severe, yet in his mind he was saving souls from eternal peril, drawing them into the light of Christ through whatever means necessary. In his relationship with the papacy, Charlemagne walked a careful line. He saw himself as protector of the Pope, defender of the Church, yet also as emperor with authority in his own right. When Pope Leo III was attacked in Rome and forced to flee in 799, it was Charlemagne who received him, who heard his pleas, and who escorted him back to safety. And it was in return for this protection that Leo, on Christmas Day of the year 800, placed the imperial crown upon Charlemagne's head. This moment, the imperial coronation, was both a gift and a question. Did Charlemagne receive his authority from the Pope? Or was the Pope merely recognizing what God had already bestowed? Charlemagne himself is said to have been surprised by the act, perhaps even uneasy. For while he valued the Pope's blessing, he believed his power flowed directly from God, not from the hands of any man. Still, the partnership was sealed. Emperor and Pope, throne and altar, each supporting the other, each bound together in the great drama of Christendom. Within his own empire, Charlemagne treated bishops as both spiritual leaders and royal officials. He granted them lands, privileges, and responsibilities, but he also expected loyalty, discipline, and service. Bishops sat in his councils, acted as judges, and carried out his commands. In this way, the Church became deeply woven into the fabric of governance, both strengthened and, in some ways, bound by the crown. Monasteries, too, flourished under his care. He encouraged them not only as places of prayer, but as centers of learning and culture. Under his guidance, monks copied manuscripts, taught children, and lived according to the rule of St. Benedict, which emphasized prayer, work, and study. These quiet houses of stone and wood, scattered across forests and valleys, became havens of peace in a world often unsettled. Charlemagne's own piety was deep and personal. He prayed daily, attended the liturgy faithfully, and supported the building of churches across his empire. In Aachen, his chapel rose like a jewel, its octagonal dome inspired by Roman and Byzantine models, its interior rich with marble and mosaic. Yet despite the grandeur, his faith was not empty ceremony. He prayed earnestly, gave alms generously, and sought to live as a servant of God, even as he ruled as master of men. His religious policy was never simply about control. It was about harmony, about weaving together the vast diversity of his empire into a single Christian whole. To him, unity in faith was the foundation of unity in politics. A people who prayed together, who sang the same hymns, who followed the same sacraments, would be stronger, steadier, more bound to one another and to their ruler. And so, in his long reign, Charlemagne became not only king and emperor, but also a kind of shepherd priest, guiding his flock with a mixture of sternness and care. He shaped the rhythm of worship, the tone of sermons, the life of monasteries, the teaching of schools, until the church itself bore the imprint of his hand. As the years passed, his efforts created a legacy that reached far beyond his own lifetime. The unity of Western Christendom, the close bond between throne and altar, the flourishing of monasteries and schools. All these would endure long after his crown was laid down. In some ways, the very idea of Europe as a Christian community found its first true form in the age of Charlemagne. At night, when the candles flickered low and silence fell upon Aachen, one can imagine the emperor kneeling in his chapel, head bowed, lips murmuring prayers. The marble walls around him gleamed softly in the torchlight. The mosaics shimmered with sacred images, and the air was heavy with incense. In that stillness, he was not conqueror, not lawgiver, not emperor. He was simply a man before God, humbly seeking grace, strength, and wisdom for the days ahead. In this quiet devotion lay the heart of his rule. His empire was vast, his armies strong, his laws firm, yet at its core, it was faith that bound it together, faith that gave it meaning, faith that turned power into purpose. And in this, Charlemagne found his truest calling, not only to rule, but to serve, not only to command, but to guide, not only to wear the crown of gold, but to bear the cross of Christ. Family life and personal character. When we speak of Charlemagne, the image that often comes to mind is that of the mighty emperor, a towering figure clad in armor, a golden crown upon his head, his scepter raised in authority. Yet behind this image, behind the throne and the banners and the courts of power, was also a man of flesh and blood, who ate at the table with his family, who laughed with his children, who walked among his people with a steady but gentle step. To truly know him, one must step away from the marble halls and into the warmth of his household, where his character revealed itself most clearly. Charlemagne was born around 2nd April 747, and though he would grow into the most powerful man of his age, he carried with him throughout life a simplicity of manner that endeared him to those closest to him. He was tall, remarkably tall for his time, said to have stood well over 6 feet, his presence commanding in any crowd. Yet he did not cloak himself in endless finery. His dress was plain, in the Frankish style, a linen shirt, a woolen tunic, stockings and shoes. On colder days, he wore a cloak fastened with a simple clasp. Only on feast days or ceremonial occasions would he don the heavy robes and jewels of empire. To him, clothing was for comfort and practicality, not ostentation. His daily habits reflected this same sense of moderation. He rose early, often before dawn, to hear Mass, to pray, and to set his mind toward the tasks of the day. Meals were simple but abundant, for he was a man of great appetite. He enjoyed roasted meats, fresh bread, fruits, and occasionally a little wine, though he was moderate in drink. He disliked drunkenness and valued clarity of thought. At meals he enjoyed the company of his children, his courtiers, and visiting scholars, often listening to readings from scripture, history, or philosophy as he ate. Family was dear to him, and in this he was not distant or cold, but affectionate and attentive. Charlemagne married several times, and though the alliances shifted with the politics of the age, he showed care for each of his wives and partners. With them, he had many children, at least 18 in total, both sons and daughters. His household was lively, filled with the sounds of youth, of chatter, of lessons, of play. He kept his children close, refusing to send them away even as they grew older. His daughters especially remained by his side, and though many sought their hands in marriage, he guarded them closely, unwilling to part with them. Some saw this as overprotectiveness, but for Charlemagne it was a matter of both love and trust. He cherished their company and preferred to keep them near, allowing them freedom of movement at court, but rarely arranging marriages that might remove them from his home. His sons, meanwhile, were educated with great care. He wanted them not only to be warriors, but also men of learning, trained in scripture, letters, and the arts of governance. In his personal character, Charlemagne was steady and balanced. He was firm in command, sometimes stern, yet rarely cruel without cause. He laughed easily, loved conversation, and showed patience with those who sought his ear. He delighted in listening to scholars debate, sometimes participating himself with questions that revealed his keen curiosity. Though his temper could flare in moments of frustration, particularly in matters of loyalty and law, he was quick to restore calm, preferring reason to wrath. He had a natural dignity that did not rely on displays of wealth. When he walked among his people, they felt his strength not from jewels or gold, but from the way he carried himself, upright, confident, watchful, yet approachable. He listened to grievances, judged disputes, and offered words of encouragement. To many, he seemed not only a ruler, but a father, someone who protected and guided as much as he commanded. Charlemagne's love of the outdoors was another mark of his character. He enjoyed riding through the countryside, inspecting farms, forests, and villages. He was an avid huntsman, often leading his retinue into the woods for deer or boar. Hunting was not merely sport for him, but a way of keeping his body strong, his senses sharp, and his connection with the land alive. In the open air, away from the formality of court, he seemed most at ease, breathing deeply of the wind, his eyes scanning the horizon, his heart refreshed by the simplicity of nature. Yet he was no stranger to tenderness. He adored his children, often playing with them, watching their games, and even joining in when time allowed. He ensured they received careful training in both arms and letters, balancing the life of the warrior with the discipline of the mind. His daughters learned music and poetry. His sons learned horsemanship and governance. In the evenings, he would sit with them, listening to their recitations, offering advice, encouraging them with warmth. Charlemagne's faith also guided his private life. He prayed daily, observed the sacraments, and supported the building and maintenance of churches, not only as emperor, but as a man of devotion. His chapel at Aachen was not only a symbol of imperial glory, but also his personal sanctuary, where he knelt in silence, seeking God's guidance. His piety was not loud or showy, but steady, woven into the rhythm of his days. There was, too, in his character, a measure of humility. Though he ruled over vast lands and countless peoples, he did not allow pride to consume him. He was conscious always of his mortality, aware that kings and emperors, too, must answer before God. He kept himself disciplined, avoiding the excesses of luxury that so often corrupted rulers. He valued learning and respected those who possessed wisdom, even if they were humble monks or scholars from distant lands. In their presence, he did not seek to dominate, but to learn, to grow, to expand his understanding of the world. Still, he was a man of his age, with faults and contradictions. His treatment of conquered peoples was often harsh, and his insistence on the Christian faith left little room for freedom of belief. His control over his daughters' lives, while born of love, was strict by modern standards. He could be relentless in pursuit of order, demanding obedience in all things. Yet even these traits arose not from cruelty, but from his deep desire to see unity, stability, and faith flourish in the world he governed. In his private moments, when the duties of the day were set aside, Charlemagne revealed himself as a man of warmth and curiosity. He enjoyed listening to music, hearing poetry, studying the stars. He tried, with patient determination, to master the art of writing, though his large, strong hands made it difficult. He kept wax tablets near his bed, practicing letters by lamplight, striving to leave behind not only the memory of his reign, but the marks of his own hand. His presence in the household was steady and reassuring. Servants, courtiers, scholars, and family alike felt the strength of his character in the smallest gestures. A nod of approval, a word of comfort, a firm judgment, spoken with fairness. He did not retreat behind walls of ceremony, but moved openly among those he governed, present in their lives, attentive to their needs. In the rhythm of his family life and the constancy of his character, one sees the foundation of his greatness. He was not only emperor by title, but also father, husband, friend, and man of faith. His household reflected the same order and care that he brought to his empire. In the laughter of his children, the songs of his daughters, the prayers of his chapel, and the simplicity of his table, Charlemagne's humanity shone as brightly as his crown. And so, when the day's councils had ended, when the hunting horns had quieted, when the court had fallen still, Charlemagne could be found in the quiet company of those he loved. His daughters singing softly, his sons reading by the fire, his scholars murmuring over books. This was the true heart of the emperor. Not only a ruler of men, but a father of a family, a man of simple tastes, and a soul seeking light. In the stillness of such nights, one can imagine him looking around the hall, his eyes resting with pride and affection upon his children, his friends, his household. Perhaps he smiled, content in that moment, knowing that beyond crowns and conquests, the truest measure of life lay in love, in character, and in the gentle ties of family. Later years and legacy. The years that once seemed endless began, as they always do, to shorten. The emperor who had marched across rivers and mountains, who had bent kingdoms beneath his banner and raised cathedrals toward heaven, began to feel the weight of time settle upon his shoulders. Charlemagne, the mighty ruler, entered the quiet season of age. In his later years, the vigor of youth and middle age gave way to slower steps, a heavier gait, and the gentle frailties that visit every mortal. His frame, once straight and commanding, stooped slightly. His hair, once thick and fair, turned to white. His face, lined by years of sun and wind, carried the marks of both hardship and laughter. He still rode, still hunted, still oversaw the affairs of his vast empire. But there was a calmness in him, a softened pace that spoke of reflection more than conquest. Charlemagne's thoughts turned often to his children, for they were his legacy as much as his empire. He had many sons and daughters, and he loved them dearly. Yet as emperor, he knew that their lives were also threads in the fabric of succession and stability. He wished to secure the future of his realm, to ensure that his empire, built with such care and labour, would not crumble when he was gone. In 806, Charlemagne drafted a plan known as the Divisio Regnorum, a division of the empire among his three legitimate sons, Charles, Pepin, and Louis. Each was to inherit a portion of the empire, ruling as king beneath the overarching unity of their father's design. It was a vision of balance, of shared responsibility, of a legacy preserved through blood and order. Yet fate is never so simple. Charles died young in 811, Pepin followed in 810, and only Louis remained. Thus, what had been planned as a division became in time a singular inheritance. Louis the Pious, as he would be called, would carry forward the mantle of his father, though his reign would differ greatly in tone and outcome. Even as his sons passed, Charlemagne found joy in his grandchildren, watching them grow, seeing in their eyes both the promise of the future and the echoes of his own youth. In their laughter and learning, he found comfort, though he knew the fragility of dynasties, the uncertainties of time. He prayed often for their wisdom, for their faith, for their strength. The emperor's later years were also marked by his continued devotion to learning. He never abandoned his wax tablets, never ceased his efforts to master the written hand. He still gathered scholars at Aachen, still delighted in their conversations, though he listened more than he spoke, content to let younger voices carry the debates. His mind, though aged, remained curious, restless, searching. He sought not only knowledge but wisdom, the deeper understanding that comes with a lifetime of ruling, of striving, of believing. Charlemagne's faith deepened in his old age. Daily mass, prayers in the chapel, hours spent in meditation became his anchor. He gave generously to churches and monasteries, ensuring their sustenance long after he would be gone. He ordered the building of hospitals, almsgiving for the poor, care for the weak and the stranger. He saw in such works the true measure of a Christian ruler, not only power but charity, not only justice but mercy. Yet he was not blind to his own mortality. He had outlived many of his children, outlasted countless companions, and seen generations pass before his eyes. He prepared himself for the end with dignity, ensuring his affairs were in order, ensuring his son Louis was recognized and prepared to lead. The crown weighed less heavily now. He wore it not as a conqueror, but as a steward, ready to hand it down. In the winter of 813, Charlemagne summoned Louis to Aachen. In a solemn ceremony, he placed the imperial crown upon his son's head, confirming him as co-emperor. This act, performed without the Pope's presence, showed Charlemagne's belief that imperial authority came directly from God, not from any earthly intermediary. It was a moment of quiet significance, the passing of the torch, the sealing of a legacy. Charlemagne's people, too, began to see him less as a distant ruler and more as a father of their world. Tales of his fairness, his strength, his devotion spread far and wide. He became, even in his lifetime, a figure of legend, larger than life, yet still beloved in the simple gestures of justice and care. To many, he seemed almost eternal, a presence that would endure as long as their villages, their churches, their fields. But even legends must yield to time. In January of 814, Charlemagne fell ill with a fever. He grew weak, his great body faltering after so many years of tireless labor. He ate little, drank less, and lay in his chamber at Aachen, surrounded by the murmured prayers of his household. The man who had once commanded armies and councils now faced the quiet trial that comes to all men. On 28th of January 814, Charlemagne died. He was 66 years old, a long life for his age, a life filled with triumphs and trials, victories and sorrows, faith and doubt. His body was placed in the great chapel at Aachen, the jewel he had built, the heart of his empire. There, beneath the soaring dome and the shimmering mosaics, he was laid to rest, dressed in imperial robes, a book of the Gospels upon his lap, his scepter in his hand. The empire mourned. From the mountains of the Pyrenees to the forests of Saxony, bells tolled, prayers rose, and people wept. They wept not only for their emperor, but for the man who had guided them, protected them, inspired them. His name, already great, became greater still in memory, carried in stories, enshrined in chronicles, sung in songs. Charlemagne's legacy was vast. He left behind not only an empire of land, but an empire of ideas. He had united much of Western Europe, forged bonds between throne and altar, nurtured learning, preserved knowledge, reformed law, and shaped the very identity of Christendom. His Carolingian Renaissance ensured that the wisdom of the past would not be lost, that the seeds of the future would be sown. In the centuries that followed, he would be remembered as the Father of Europe, a title that captured both the breadth of his rule and the depth of his care. His empire did not last unchanged, divided, altered, reshaped by time, but his influence endured. The idea of a united Christian Europe, of an emperor crowned in both power and faith, would echo through the ages, inspiring kings, popes, and dreamers. And yet, for all the grandeur of his legacy, it was perhaps in the smallest details of his life that Charlemagne's greatness truly shone. The way he sat among his children at supper, the way he prayed quietly in his chapel, the way he practiced letters by candlelight, the way he listened with patience to those who sought his ear. In these moments, the emperor was not distant or untouchable, but profoundly human, a man striving, learning, loving, believing. The legend of Charlemagne grew after his death, wrapped in tales of miracles, of divine favor, of heroic deeds. Yet beneath the legend lies the truth of a man who lived fully, who carried the burdens of empire with strength, and who sought, in all things, to serve God and his people. His later years were not marked by conquest, but by reflection, not by expansion, but by preparation, not by pride, but by humility. In them we see the full arc of a life, the vigor of youth, the power of maturity, the wisdom of age, and the peace of an end well met. And so, when the candles dim and the chapel falls silent, one can imagine Charlemagne's spirit resting not in the pomp of empire, but in the quiet faith that guided him, the gentle rhythms of family, the enduring love of learning, and the eternal hope of God's grace. Death, memory, and enduring legend. The passing of Charlemagne on 28th of January 814 marked not only the end of a life, but the close of an age. The emperor who had ruled for more than 4 decades, who had built a Christian empire across Western Europe, who had guided his people with strength and faith, was gone. And yet, in many ways, he was not gone at all. His memory lingered, vast and luminous, like the afterglow of a great fire, warming generations long after its flame had dimmed. In the days that followed his death, Aachen was filled with silence and sorrow. The city that had thrummed with the energy of scholars, craftsmen, nobles, and priests now seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. The bells of the great chapel tolled again and again, their echoes stretching across the Rhineland, carried on the cold winter air. Charlemagne's body was placed within the Palatine Chapel, the heart of his beloved city. His tomb was set in the same space where he had worshipped, prayed, and celebrated Mass. He had built this chapel as a symbol of faith and empire, and now it became his resting place. Dressed in imperial robes, seated as if enthroned, with a golden crown upon his head and the Gospels upon his lap, he was buried not only as a king, but as a ruler of eternal dignity. The people mourned him deeply. Villagers in distant fields spoke of the emperor who had brought peace, who had shielded them from raids, who had ensured that justice was done in their towns. Monks and scholars prayed for his soul, remembering the man who had given them the means to copy sacred texts, to preserve knowledge, to build libraries that would last centuries. Nobles who had once ridden beside him in campaigns recalled his strength, his laughter, his discipline. To them, he was not merely a sovereign, but a leader of men, someone whose presence had steadied their courage. Yet even as grief settled, so too did remembrance. Charlemagne became larger in death than he had been in life. Chronicles described him in glowing terms, magnifying his deeds, polishing his memory. He was remembered as the model of the Christian king, one whose authority came from God, one whose sword defended the faithful, one whose laws upheld order and mercy. Over the centuries, legends blossomed around his name. Tales told of Charlemagne as a knight of God, leading armies of angels in visions of the faithful. Songs, the chansons de geste, painted him as the hero of Christendom, battling Saracens, defending the church, living a life of endless valor. These legends were not history, but they reflected the truth of how he was loved, remembered, and needed by the generations that followed. In 1165, centuries after his death, Charlemagne was canonized by Antipope Pascal III. Though this canonization was never universally accepted by the Church, still, in Aachen and beyond, people revered him as a saint, believing that his life had been touched by divine purpose. His tomb became a site of pilgrimage, his memory a source of strength. The empire he had built did not endure in the same form. His son, Louis the Pious, inherited his crown, but divisions soon arose. By the Treaty of Verdun in 843, Charlemagne's empire was split among his grandsons, giving birth to the future kingdoms of France and Germany, as well as the Middle Kingdom that would later dissolve. Though the unity he had forged did not last, the idea of empire remained, echoing in the Holy Roman Empire, which saw itself as his heir. His legacy was not measured only in borders or crowns, but in the culture he nurtured. The Carolingian Renaissance he inspired ensured that Latin learning, classical texts, and Christian theology were preserved. Monasteries across Europe copied manuscripts, kept alive the wisdom of antiquity, and laid the foundation for the intellectual flowering of the later Middle Ages. Without Charlemagne's vision, much might have been lost to the silence of time. He was remembered also as a lawgiver. His capitularies, those decrees and reforms that shaped justice in his empire, lived on in custom and precedent. He had tried to weave a fabric of fairness, to balance the might of kingship with the mercy of Christian duty. His example of leadership, firm yet faithful, powerful yet humble before God, inspired generations of rulers who longed to live up to his standard. And in the hearts of the people, Charlemagne remained more than an emperor. He was a symbol of order, faith, and unity. To peasants, he was the ruler who had brought stability. To scholars, he was the patron of wisdom. To the church, he was the defender of the faith. To all of Europe, he was the image of what a king could be. As centuries passed, his name endured. Poets sang of him, emperors claimed his mantle, churches honored him, and nations traced their origins to his reign. He became simply Charlemagne the Great, the father of Europe, The bridge between the ancient world and the medieval, the ruler whose shadow stretched across 1,000 years. And yet beyond the grandeur of his legacy, one may imagine the man himself in his final days. A father watching his children grow an old warrior, remembering the fields of battle. A learner tracing letters on wax tablets. A Christian kneeling in prayer within his chapel. In these quiet images, his humanity is revealed. Not only the emperor of vast dominions, but the man of faith, of family, of hope. His story, when told as a gentle rhythm, becomes less a tale of conquest and more a lullaby of endurance, a reminder that even the greatest among us seek peace in the end. For Charlemagne's greatest legacy was not merely an empire, but the example of a life lived with purpose, devotion, and the steady pursuit of something greater than himself. And so, as the candlelight flickers low and the world drifts into silence, we leave Charlemagne at rest in Aachen, where his spirit lingers still. The great dome above his tomb glows with mosaics of heaven. The stones echo faintly with centuries of prayer, and the memory of the emperor hums like a soft song through the ages. His empire has faded, but his story endures, calming and eternal, like the slow tide of history itself. Thank you for listening to Sleepy Stories tonight. I hope this tale has brought you comfort, calm, and a step closer to rest. If you enjoyed this story, you'll find many more gentle journeys into the lives of remarkable figures from history, each told softly, to ease your mind and help you drift off. You can explore the full playlist of Sleepy Stories whenever you'd like, or simply let the next video play, and I'll guide you through another soothing chapter of the past. Until then, may your night be peaceful, your dreams gentle, and your sleep deep. Good night.